Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode of the Mind Yourself podcast with myself here and Christy. So today we're going to be talking about, obviously, given the last pretty much year we've all experienced with COVID and everything else, I'm sure on the tip of our tongue every day is how stressed we are all these days. So today, myself and Christy are going to have a little bit of a chat around stress, what it is, and what it means for us and the different ways it impacts us. So just starting off, Christy, just to kind of get the ball rolling, it'd be great. Can you just give me a bit of background as to what stress really is?
Okay, I'm going to start this by priming it, saying that this is something that I've learned throughout my education, but I will not say at all that I'm an expert on stress. But it is really, really important to understand stress, to understand psychology and mental health. And so, answering your question, stress is our body and brain's reaction to a challenge. And basically, it's really important because it is the one major factor that links physical health with mental health, whereby the hard scientists, the ones into physics, biology and chemistry will argue that basically psychology is a bit airy-fairy, like what do you think, what do you feel, you can't objectively measure that. But stress is the one aspect of psychology that you can objectively measure. Like you can basically look at the body specifically and look at the physiological reaction to something. And so it's really, really important for that. And so explaining exactly what stress is, you're going to be coming back to old school biology here.
Okay, back to the good leaving cert days.
Yes, exactly. So I'm going to explain this as simple as possible that I hope everybody can understand, but it's still kind of complicated. So stress basically activates a part of the brain known as the hypothalamus, and this in itself is a gland. So what I mean by a gland is it's something that or an organ, is an organ or a gland is something that releases hormones, and hormones basically make our body work. So this hypothalamus is an organ, and it releases, basically it activates the pituitary gland, which is then also in the brain, and then the pituitary gland then activates the sympathetic nervous system. So we have two nervous systems. Yeah,
I'm giving biology lesson.
We have the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. So basically, the sympathetic nervous system is what dilates pupils. It's what inhibits saliva. It accelerates the heartbeat. It stops digestion. It stimulates adrenaline and epinephrine, and it stimulates basically the whole body to get ready to fight or flight. This is the process used for fight or flight.
Yeah, that was what I was about to ask. I was like, when you said it's response to a challenge, is that like what we say about fight or flight?
Yeah.
So this is a historical reaction that we would have had ingrained in us almost as a safety mechanism as much as anything else.
Yeah. So basically it's just getting our body. So going back to it, starts in the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus stimulates then the pituitary gland, which then activates the sympathetic nervous system, which the pituitary gland is basically the messenger from your brain to the rest of your body, to all the glands and all the organs in your body. And then, for example, one of these organs is the adrenal gland, which then releases adrenaline or non-adrenaline. And this is an important note for everybody to know, because I didn't know this for years. Adrenaline and non-adrenaline and epinephrine and norepinephrine are the same things. So adrenaline and epinephrine are basically two types of hormones that there was a group of researchers in the UK who called it adrenaline, and there was a group of researchers in America who called it epinephrine. And they've continued to basically use it differently, which really confuses things, even though they're the same thing. But anyway, so again, going back to try and picture this.
Okay.
Hypothalamus.
Yeah.
Basically is stimulated, and a hormone known as, I'm not even going to try and pronounce this, but CRH, so corticotropin releasing hormone, then goes to pituitary gland, which then activates another hormone known as ACTH, also known as corticotropin. And then this basically activates all the relevant glands or all the relevant organs in the body. And then this releases hormones throughout the body, and then all the effects happen, like I mentioned, which is the sympathetic nervous system. Does that make sense?
So, okay, so to kind of like just simplify that to make sure I get that clear. So basically, some scenario takes place. You either see it, hear it, whatever the actual cause of the stress takes place. Your body then reacts to that by knocking this gland called the hypothalamus in your brain, kicks off, which then sends a message to your pituitary gland.
Which is also in the brain.
Which is what?
Which is also in the brain, the pituitary gland.
Which is also in the brain. So those two glands in the brain react to the scenario that you're experiencing, which then sends the message to your body to make that stress reaction. That can come in many forms. It can be, as you said, pupils dilating. It could be sweat glands, maybe. Is that probably one of them?
Perfect, yeah.
Your hair standing up on the back of your neck. Aches and pains, all those kind of things that we associate with stress.
And the important message here is that what people used to think is that the body worked independent, but this basically this hypothalamus emphasizes this idea that the brain itself is the master organ. Like it doesn't work without the brain. And this is quite new. Like it was only discovered in the 1970s that the hypothalamus is actually a gland, or it's an organ in itself. There was two guys, one French guy called Guillaume, and then there was another guy called Chaly, and these two hated each other. They were researchers trying to prove this. So they ended up in this mad race to try and basically prove that the hypothalamus, or within the brain, that the brain itself is an organ, and it's not the pituitary gland. And they ended up eventually... Like they really hated each other, but they ended up sharing the Nobel Prize because they essentially proved it something like 3 weeks in between.
Wow.
And like this goes back to the idea, for example, there was an explosion of this idea that you could get new testes, for example, to inject testosterone into your body so that you never aged, for example, or you could always remain extremely masculine.
Okay.
But there was actually research done that proved that even if you inject yourself with testosterone, it still doesn't change the mechanisms of the body, because it's not your testes themselves that are responsible for the release of testosterone in the body, but it's actually the hypothalamus in the brain, and you can't change the hypothalamus. So it's always the brain that's in control of all these hormones that are released throughout the body, and the brain is what controls the stress response, essentially.
Okay, interesting. Okay, so when we say stress, this is another thing I want to understand, is stress considered an emotion? So when I say I am stressed, is this just a biological reaction to a scenario? Is it an emotion? What is actually stress? What is it?
This is an excellent question, because for example, there's a stressed emoji, which would indicate that it's an emotion. But when you Google is stress an emotion, it doesn't actually answer the question. Me personally, I don't think it is. I think it's basically just the reaction of your body and your brain to a challenge. I don't think it's an emotion in itself.
And there's probably an emotion attached to that. So you could be, you might feel a number of emotions in that experience, but it's more a bodily reaction rather than an actual emotion you feel.
Yeah. And there's of course similarities. Like for example, with anxiety, that CRH, that the hormone that your hypothalamus releases first, that has links with stress, but it also has links with anxiety, for example, that if you can basically, it activates anxiety and it activates stress. But I would say, going back to what you were talking about earlier, is it's the mechanism that basically stimulates that fight or flight response that goes back to our ancestors. It basically prepares our body to get ready to do something, but I still wouldn't describe it as an emotion. It's more the mechanism behind possible emotions. If that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah, so that's what I find quite interesting, and going back to what you just mentioned about this fight or flight. So I suppose when we look at all emotions, and you've said this before in previous podcasts and in other places, how all our emotions are ancestral kind of experiences that have been brought up through the generations due to experience with certain environmental things. So in this case, it's not an emotion, but stress was a mechanism to respond to certain threats or situations that our ancestors experienced. Now, the reason I think this is interesting, this topic is something I'm really interested in getting more into, is the fact that, in the past, that fight or flight response was relevant because, if our ancestor came across a threat, a tiger, a lion, whatever it was important to have that kind of initial reaction. But nowadays, it almost seems like, and it comes from, when you look up, and I looked up today on my phone, as in all the phrases to describe how you're stressed. And like, it's like in the English language alone, the amount of different ways you talk about being stressed, like I've lost the plot. There's now a spanner thrown in the works. I'm at breaking point. It's doing my head in. All those phrases. Like there's a million ways to describe your stress. So it seems like in the 21st century, there's so many more things that put us at that level of stress that the actual stress reaction is almost a constant at times now, which surely can't be good for our mental health. Because I mean, in the past, it was a short-term reaction to a scenario where it seems like we're all at a low level, particularly in 2020. We were and going into this coming year with all the kind of COVID situation. But it seems like that can't be a good thing, that we have that stress reaction on a more kind of continual basis.
So there's 2 points to make there. Firstly, I'm going to refer, if people are interested in stress, the best author undoubtedly you can read he's called Rob Sapolsky. I think he's the head of psychology in Yale. But this guy is brilliant. Like he's interesting to read. One of his main books is called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And this relates to the point you're making in that, like, every animal has stress. Like, every animal has this fight or flight response. Like, for example, the zebra, when it's being attacked by a lion, has the fight or flight response. So it has the same stress response as humans do. But where this is different is that because humans have the ability to think ahead and plan, their stress response is also sensitive to anticipated stress, of this possibility of something happening. And I always find the point interesting that humans are the only animals that have the ability to think, but they're also the only animals that kill themselves. I do think, obviously, that's impossible to prove, but I do think there's a correlation there. And I also do think...
So that's not been proven, but that's just a theory that humans are the only animals to kill themselves. But I suppose, as you said, how do you prove that another animal hasn't? It's very hard to do.
Yeah. But it relates then to stress as well, in that, like, so basically we can create anticipatory stress, and that's why zebras don't get ulcers and we do. We have now developed specific responses and dangerous physical and mental health responses to this anticipatory stress and I'm after losing my frame of thought there. The other important point I want to make is I feel like stress is a really, really interesting topic, because people know, for example, they know their basics. Like, they know that, like, stress can lead to, like, heart attacks, or they can lead to ulcers, or they can lead to like diabetes. But I also don't think people are aware of what stress does, what it stops. Like, for example, how it can basically stop your ability to reproduce, so sexual reproduction, or like how it stops like weight gain or metabolism, which can lead to weight gain. I don't think people know this enough, and I do think it's really, really important, which is why we're having this discussion. And we've already discussed this, but it can be something that we can talk about for weeks possibly. But we'll try and minimize it to a few.
And keep it kind of tangible and easy to understand. But I think that's interesting how you said that. So basically, the way this anticipatory stress, which is an interesting concept, but is basically how, because we imagine negative situations and therefore preempt them and therefore stress about them before they even happen. Whereas an animal, say like a zebra, actually only gets those stress reactions in the moment when the incident actually occurs. So we're actually extending the potential stress we can experience basically as a negative to having an imagination, which in a lot of cases might be seen as a good thing. But that is an interesting... And I mean, my hope from this conversation, and if we do have further conversations, is that people will come away with understanding stress a little bit more and how it's caused. And particularly, then how to deal with it and ways to maybe overcome it, and just understanding a little bit more around the research around it. Because, as I said, it's something we say a lot. It's something we throw away comment. I'm stressed, this, that, and the other. But we all have experienced stress in different ways. So that would be kind of my hope from the conversation. We can weed out some of that research and make it a little bit more digestible for people, I suppose.
Yeah. So I think this is the best way to do it. So I'm just going to repeat it again. I know some people want to hear it, but basically the process is hypothalamus, pituitary gland, and then to other organs in the body, particularly the adrenal gland, which releases. And each of these glands in different parts, or each of these organs in different parts of the body, they essentially they release different hormones. And this is where it gets complicated because there's so many different types of hormones. Like most people only think of adrenaline, for example, with stress. But for example, there's antidiuretic hormone, which stops us needing to pee when we're feeling stressed.
I remember that from school.
Yeah. Or there's, for example, like you have your estrogen, your testosterone, which is related to sexual reproduction, for example. And then you have your endorphins. So when somebody is stressed, in a majorly stressful situation, they feel less pain, for example. That's why a soldier in war could get shot and they mightn't even feel it. The reason why is because endorphins are released when we're in a stressful situation, and so we don't feel pain as much. And there's loads, like I could go on, like glucogen's another one, or like as I mentioned, glucocorticoids, epinephrine, norepinephrine, or adrenaline. As I said, there's lots and lots of different hormones released.
So, and what's interesting about that is, though, as well, and an interesting thing to understand is stress isn't necessarily always, like, stress in the English language is often assumed as a negative, and we use stress as a negative term. But as you said, some of these stress reactions and like responses are actually responses that are meant to help us in situations where it's required. So stress isn't always a negative thing. It's actually a bodily reaction that is there to help us.
100%. And we'll talk more about this later, but there's this term known as eustress, which is this idea of there's an optimum level of stress. You don't want no stress in your life. You need, so like, as I mentioned, there's the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system is what basically like speeds up our heartbeat and like basically stops like digestion happening, and like it's when we're in a stressful situation. The parasympathetic nervous system is then when we're sleeping, and this is for like recovery and stuff like that. But like if you're only activating your parasympathetic nervous system, that's not healthy either. A really good way to remember this, how I always remembered it, is and this is why breathing is so important. When you breathe in, you're activating your sympathetic nervous system, and when you breathe out, you're activating your parasympathetic nervous system. And that's why meditations, so many of them are based on this idea, because you're trying to activate both systems. It's because it's about balancing them.
So your parasystematic nervous system,
sympathetic. So
the parasympathetic nervous system is responsible for all the bodily reactions that you don't actively control.
So no, I wouldn't say that, because it's a lot like there's stuff that are under our control and not under our control. But the parasympathetic nervous system is basically based on this recovery or restoring your body. So
that makes sense.
Just like sleep, basically, like when we're asleep, the parasympathetic nervous system is all that's activated. But if we're woken up unexpectedly because of something dangerous, our sympathetic nervous system will basically turn on, and then this will activate the stuff like adrenaline and glucocorticoids.
Okay, so the sympathetic nervous,
like the emotion, yeah.
Okay, so parasympathetic nervous system is responsible for the recovery aspect and the sort of like, recharge, and the sympathetic nervous system is around kick-starting and
fight or flight,
activating all those kind of responses, that fight or flight response. Okay, that makes sense. Okay.
And then so as you mentioned, like we need both. Like we do need stress. Like we need to activate those hormones around our body every so often. Like it is important, and we can still be exposed to dangerous situations. So we do want our sympathetic nervous system working as well. So it's not about having one or the other. It's about balancing both. That's the important thing. But as you mentioned, particularly today, the biggest problem now is that the sympathetic nervous system is probably overactivated, and this is why there's been this explosion of
we don't get enough of the parasympathetic nervous system. We're not probably sleeping properly, we're not recovering properly, we're not doing the things that are meant to recharge that system.
Yeah, and so this then increases the risk of, for example, the biggest one, cardiovascular disease, is the biggest killer, like heart attacks, for example, and this is mainly because of stress.
Yeah, So I think a nice place to kind of go from here. So that's kind of a nice kind of high level of what stress is and where it comes from. But I think it'd be nice to kind of start that conversation, because this is where I think people are going to get value out of, is understanding those bodily reactions, because they're the things that we're actually going to experience. Be it, like, as you said, cardiovascular was the first one. We could probably start there. Understanding that the role of the stress response on that, and then, you know, what we need to be aware of that can maybe actually help us, you know, prevent cardiovascular illness and things like that, I think would be one that's actually a tangible thing people can take away. So let's start there. Like cardiovascular, how does that fit into that stress chain when you go from your brain to your adrenaline glands to then into your actual organs?
Okay, so this is actually quite straightforward, and it's something that I think everybody should know. So give me a stressful situation that you might have that is reasonable.
That is reasonable.
Yeah.
The day before an exam and you haven't studied enough.
Perfect. Okay, so you're under stress then. So you're thinking about the exam. Basically, what happens is your hypothalamus activates. It then sends the hormones to the pituitary gland, which then sends hormones then to the adrenal glands, and then adrenaline and glucocorticoids are released from the thing. And then our heart is beating faster, our eyes restrict, for example, and our body might stiffen up. All these automatic responses. Now, that's okay, as we mentioned. That's not the issue. Like, for example, that might drive us on then, okay, I need to study more, so you might go study. But the problem is, if this is on all of the time, if after the exam, once you finish, your parasympathetic nervous system doesn't activate again, but your sympathetic nervous system's just thinking about the next exam then, and your stress response is on all of the time. Because what happens is, when that's turned on all of the time, there's constantly those hormones going around your body, basically, like getting ready for a stressful situation, even though there's no end to it. So there's more blood flow going around the body. And so the body is amazing in that it reacts to this heavy blood flow all of the time. So it basically thickens its arteries walls. So it basically thickens to prepare for the increased blood flow. But the problem is there's some miscommunication there, because as the artery walls thicken, your heart then thinks, oh, our body needs more blood. So there's more blood being pumped out. And then what can end up happening then is there's more blood coming into the heart as opposed to going out. And what happens then is this imbalance of blood coming into the heart can then cause irregular heartbeats. Does that make sense?
Wow. That's such a fascinating miscommunication, and like actually how it then biologically results in your body.
And this, of course, is then high blood pressure as well. So like hypertension. Now, like, as I mentioned, like, anybody involved in medicine is probably laughing at me now because I've explained that incredibly simplistically, but that's the whole point of this. Yeah. So that's one thing that happens, which leads to higher blood pressure. The second thing that happens is then, because there's more blood being rushed around the body, the artery walls are more likely to be like damaged due to wear and tear. So blood vessels are more likely to be cut, and then this can also be dangerous then, but this also then has a knock-on effect, because what ends up happening then is the body starts trying to send stuff like platelets to deal with the wear and tear to like recover. Okay. And then what ends up happening is, and there's also lots of nutrients and stuff flying around the body, because in the stress response, digestion turns off. So, for example, the nutrients taken in from food are not being processed. So they're kind of just floating around the body as well. And then all of this crud can then combine and get stuck in an artery, which creates arteriosclerosis, which is basically like a clog in your blood. Yeah. And then this, of course, can then lead to, I should mention as well, this obviously excited people, because what happened was doctors and researchers started looking at these different parts of crud that can get stuck. And this led to the explosion of cholesterol, because one of these things that can get stuck is cholesterol. And that's why, if you probably remember when we were growing up, people were saying, oh, cholesterol is really, really bad. And like every ad was saying low cholesterol. Yeah. When it turns out that it's actually not a very good measure at all of getting heart attacks or heart disease. Really? because there's good cholesterol and there's bad cholesterol, which I suppose we'll talk more about when we talk about digestion. But
that crud is what we call cholesterol, or it isn't?
No, it's just one certain type of that crud, for example. There's lots
okay.
of different types. What seems to be a far better measure of heart attack is something known as C-Reactive Protein, and this is very hot at the moment. Because what
C-Reactive
happens
protein
is when blood vessels are damaged, the C-reactive protein is basically created in the liver and it goes to the damaged cells. So if somebody is showing high C-reactive protein, that means that they obviously have high levels of hypertension and high levels of like cut blood vessels, which then increases your risk of having a heart attack. Because again, going back, what ends up happening is when all those arteries get clogged up, you then increase the risk of having a stroke or having a myocardial infarction. And then particularly, if you clog up specifically the coronary artery, then you're going to have a myocardial infarction, which is essentially a heart attack. And then this can obviously lead to chest pain, like angina, then anytime you have a stressful situation, because they're being clogged then. And so the best way to break it down then, just trying to summarize it, is it's three things. It's firstly the increase of blood pressure, because if you're constantly stressed, your blood pressure skyrockets. So that can cause irregular heartbeats as well, because of the imbalance of what's going in the blood. It can tear blood vessels and it can endanger blood vessels, and then it can also lead to these blockage of blood vessels through arteriosclerosis. And that is why stress is so detrimental to our heart, or why it can cause heart attacks.
So when that positive, so just to kind of make sure I get it right in my head. So yeah, when we're under a stressful situation, what we need is we need our different bodily aspects, be it your brain, be it your muscles, to react in a kind of a more, alert, aggressive way. In that study scenario, you're meant to be like, that's maybe why. I know you can correct me if I'm wrong here. Do you know, sometimes you say when you're stressfully studying at the last minute, you find sometimes more goes in a short space of time than sometimes in a longer space of time. Is that to do with the fact that there's maybe more blood, oxygen, whatever being moved around the body, that your brain's operating maybe a bit more optimally?
Possibly. I couldn't answer that now,
but what you're saying is, and that's fine for a short period of time to react to the stressful situation, but clearly the experience puts your body under severe stress and pressure. And obviously in the cardiovascular situation, it's, weakening your blood vessels from tears because it's moving around so fast. Your heart is all over the place because it's getting irregular kind of amounts of blood, and so the heartbeat's impacted. And then because all those nutrients and things are rushing around the body but aren't being used because you're trying to just move everything along, what happens is things get clogged up, and that can lead to blood clots and therefore potentially heart attacks. So all this stuff is fine in a short burst to help you respond to a certain situation, but given our current lifestyles where we struggle to come down from those highs and give ourselves a moment to recover, we're not giving our body a time to recover from that pressure and stress that they put themselves under. Is that what you're basically saying?
Yeah, exactly. And then one more point that's important too is that if your stress response, or if your sympathetic nervous system is always on, that means that your parasympathetic nervous system is going to be inactive. And the parasympathetic nervous system turns off the stress response. So as it becomes more and more inactive, so if you continue being stressed chronically for a long period of time, then your parasympathetic nervous system basically doesn't really know how to turn on. And as a result, the stress response can't be turned off, not only in your head, but also in your body. And this is what leads to heart disease and many of the other different disorders and health issues that we're going to talk about.
And that's like heart disease. Obviously, we're not saying that all heart disease is caused by stress, but what you're saying is in probably heart disease in people that might necessarily be healthy in certain circumstances, but are causing themselves undue pressure to their heart and to their cardiovascular system, not from their diet or other aspects, but actually from their dealing with stressful situations and managing their stress levels.
Yeah. You've highlighted something incredibly important there, in that stress never ever causes anything. It's not the cause behind anything, but it's not the cause of any certain death, for example. But what stress does is it highly increases the risk of you developing health issues, such as cardiovascular disease. So it's not that stress is the be all and end all. It's not, if I cancel out stress out of my life, everything will be okay. It just reduces, it makes you a healthier person, essentially.
So being stressed on top of not having a good diet and not living a healthy lifestyle is only going to exacerbate the risks that you have of being, of probably, you might be underlying conditions that may lead to something, and stress could be the trigger that sends you over the edge into one of these kind of illnesses. So it's actually something, people should address and not just,
yeah, 100%. But I think it's worth noting as well, is that us as a society don't deal with stress well. And I think that can actually be demonstrated through heart disease. One interesting point I want to make, last point, is that there's this really weird thing that's happening, basically. That's like, even if I just ask you, who do you think males or females have higher rates of cardiovascular disease?
I would say males.
Yes, you're exactly right. Women are on average 10 years older than men when they're likely to get a heart attack as well. But what's very, very interesting is that it's falling quite rapidly for males, the rate of cardiovascular disease, but it's massively increasing for women. They don't know why this is. Now, they have theorized that it was different lifestyles. Like, for example, men were more likely to work and be the breadwinners, but there's been research done on this and it's wrong. It has no influence on it.
What are you talking now? Are you saying that has no influence on the dropping rate, or has no influence on the fact that men have more cardiovascular disease?
You see, women are working more now, are the equivalent to men now. They're living similar lifestyles, and so it's still, that's not the factor they've looked at.
So lifestyles clearly is now not lifestyles clearly can't be used as a potential cause, because now we're on par in relation to that.
One specific lifestyle of basically like working, and obviously having a household and trying to work at the same time.
Interesting. I wonder, is it the fact that women are slightly, well, obviously it's increasing for women, so maybe this is completely false as well, but I would have said, if you're to ask me, I would have said, before you explained that it was dropping for men and increasing for women, I probably would have said that it's, men are probably not as good at managing stress levels and maybe lose their stress more, and that can come back to the whole constant conversation around men and managing their mental health. Again, a serious area that needs addressing. Maybe men are less better at dealing and managing with stress and recovering and kicking off that parasympathetic nervous system.
Yeah, I'd say, like, obviously that's a fact. Again, it's just, there's definitely so many factors. Biologically, the big thing in like the 1990s was estrogen.
Okay.
So women, as I mentioned, are their chances of getting a heart attack increases massively when they go into menopause.
Okay.
Because estrogen, which is their like sexual reproductive hormone, when estrogen is released, this reduces their chances of getting cardiovascular disease. And people start getting really excited, particularly the drug companies, because their plan then was to start selling estrogen. But then there was this huge study done by Women's Health Initiative, and they were testing the benefits of estrogen and progestin. So progestin basically prevents ovulation during pregnancy. So they were testing injections, and it actually had to be cancelled halfway through this study, because it was actually turning out that estrogen and progestin was actually causing or like increasing the risk of cardiovascular disease. And to this day, they still don't know why. Like the immediate explanation to why this could have been happening was because it wasn't just estrogen, it was estrogen and progestin, but there still hasn't been an explanation to it. Another one possibly is that while estrogen protects against the formation of arteriosclerosis, and to this day they still don't know why. Like the immediate explanation to why this could have been happening was because it wasn't just estrogen, it was estrogen and progestin, but it can't stop it already happening and then trying to prevent it afterwards.
Yeah,
if that makes sense. Which I think is like the most likely explanation.
But they haven't, and back to that, they still haven't found a conclusive answer as to why traditionally men's cardiovascular illnesses were higher in men than women, but are now starting to reduce for men and increase for women. They still haven't come to a conclusion on that, have they?
But they won't, like it something like that's so difficult to measure because it's always constantly changing.
Okay.
You know, like the statistics on it and stuff. So like it's very, very difficult to measure something that's changing as you're trying to measure it, for example.
And like we said, well, obviously, you know, from the, you know, medical and biological field, you know, we're not experts on that aspect of it. But if stress is considered a key triggering factor for cardiovascular illnesses, we've already mentioned how stress is a experience that was formed in our ancestors in a world that was completely different. So being able to figure out how stress can cause cardiovascular diseases today is very difficult because the external situations that are causing that stress are changing so much that a kid growing up today might experience completely different life and situations than their parents that could cause stress that was otherwise unaware of because you know their experiences that their parents never went through, so it would never been considered a cause of stress before.
I want to, but I won't. That perfectly brings us on to our next topic about how stress can essentially be passed down during pregnancy and why stress during pregnancy is so important and the development of stress in a fetus.
Wow.
But I think we will hold off there because that's way too much.
I was about to say, hold that thought on that excellent cliffhanger. Stay tuned. But yeah, no, I think that's fascinating, and I think understanding the process of how stress goes through the body first, how it kicks off a biological reaction in the body, but then also understanding, you know, particularly for the cardiovascular area, what those reactions are, understanding how they're relevant for that stressful situation, but then how when they're prolonged, they can cause cardiovascular disease and sometimes, obviously in the worst cases, death. It's interesting to realize then the importance of that stress management and mindfulness and giving yourself that opportunity to relax and recover in between those situations. I think is something that people wouldn't have otherwise known about.
Exactly. So I think we should probably announce then, like, this is going to be the start of, we're going to discuss how stress influences essentially all aspects of our health, how it can affect our sexual reproduction or our sex lives, for example. And most importantly, we're obviously going to finish on how it can influence our mental health. But other than that, Owen, I think we will leave it there.
I think so. I think given the year that or almost a year that we've all had with COVID and everything else, I think stress is a deeply fascinating and interesting topic that I think everyone's trying to get better at managing. So I think it will be a very interesting couple of episodes to kind of dive into that. So I think that's everything for today. Any of the links and any of the kind of research and topics that we've mentioned, as always, will be mentioned and will be kind of copied in the show notes for you to kind of follow up on. And if you have any questions on stress or anything else, feel free to shoot us a message on social media or anything. We're always here to kind of help answer those questions as well. So that's all from me. That's all from Christy. And as always, mind yourselves.